There can be no doubt. I mean, we've had 18 months plus of living through the pandemic, and I think for all of us, it's been a huge shock, a huge upheaval in terms of the way we've been living our lives. And I think most of us have got a fair degree of awareness about the scale of the impact it's had on our society, on workers in our society, and around the world. But I've got some sort of facts and figures I want to run through to sort of illustrate how severe this has been and the impact on the working class. I mean, first and foremost, I think we need to consider, the huge death toll that's happened, and have a sort of look at why that has happened. There's no doubt that that COVID-19 has been an absolutely deadly disease. We're approaching over 130,000 deaths, and you can see here in two major ways. This is the cumulative figures, and we can say sort of categorically that that's down to a failure to implement lockdown. We have a virulent illness to which we have not had people haven't had immunity, and it's ripped through our society, almost breaking the NHS and causing devastation in care homes. And the result has been one of the highest death rates in the world in the UK, and we can put this firmly on Boris Johnson's doorstep. If we compare, for instance, with New Zealand, who this week had a single detected case and immediately implemented a lockdown, and we look at their total coronavirus cases, which is 2,926, and a total deaths of just 26 people, we compare those 26 deaths with the 130,000 we've had in the UK, and we can see that the decisions that governments make in terms of how they respond to the crisis has huge implications. And Boris Johnson's consistently put profit before people, reluctant to implement lockdowns, then implementing them too late, allowing businesses to stay open that really shouldn't have stayed open, and effectively allowing COVID to rip through society. This initial strategy was herd immunity, and it certainly feels like they've never really abandoned that. As they now approach Freedom Day, we've got supposedly back to normal. Figures are still on over 800 deaths a day still, and comparable infection rates to the beginning of the second wave, going back to last October. And not only is it killing people, but we've got 1 million people who have now got long COVID. So this is quite an unknown illness with a very diverse sort of presentation. Some people have got quite severe neurological impacts where they have got trouble concentrating, trouble even standing, maintaining balance. People have got severe fatigue, and then other people have got organ damage, or a combination of all these. And as infections continue to spread, we're going to see the death rate rise, and we're all going to see more and more people with long COVID. But we're still not out of the woods by a long shot. And we have to consider what the impact's going to be into the future in terms of the strain on the NHS. We've now obviously got huge waiting lists of people who haven't received care. That's all backed up, and also on top of that, you've got people developing more and more illnesses as we go along, and the toll on the NHS staff as well, who paid a huge price in terms of the numbers that have died, but a huge psychological toll at a time when the NHS is severely underfunded, and we've got 100,000 vacancies, and that's looking set to grow. So, we need actually more people in the NHS than ever before. And if we look at who's been affected, we see quite clearly, this is not bankers, hedge funds, or multimillionaires. It's frontline workers, people who've had to keep society going through the pandemic, are the ones been most exposed, and also the ones who are working more proximity to people are the ones who've been more likely to contract it. So if you look across that graph there, you'll see that's predominantly low-paid workers, in a lot of cases retail assistants, postal workers and couriers, people working in elementary storage, shop workers, and then healthcare assistants and care workers, some of the lowest paid people in society. And in terms of the impact of what it's done to people in work, then you can see that huge drop there is the start of the pandemic, where people were being furloughed, where workplaces were closed down, and that's a massive drop in the amount of hours that people worked and their earning potential. And we can see how it's sort of starting to rise back into this year, but it's still way below the level, the pre-pandemic level. And a TUC poll revealed that nearly a quarter of workers in Britain have experienced a downgrade of their terms during the crisis, including through reduced pay or changes to their hours. And 1 in 3 young workers aged between 18 and 24 say their terms at work have deteriorated since March. And on top of that, we've got 1 million people have been forced onto benefits. So these are people who weren't protected by furlough, people who had a reasonable income, have been forced onto subsistence benefits, with all the implications that brings with it in terms of whether people's houses being under threat and being able to maintain their lifestyles. And this shows us the numbers who are put on furlough. I mean, interestingly about this is that the huge peak on the furlough was right at the beginning. And even though we had a much bigger sort of infection wave with a much bigger death rate over Christmas and the New Year, the furlough rate has actually stayed quite low, suggesting that people have been pushed back to work irrespective of the safety. And a poll published by TUC reveals that 9% of workers have been told to reapply for their jobs on worse terms and conditions since the first lockdown in March. And nearly a fifth of 18 to 24-year-olds say their employers tried to rehire them on inferior terms during the pandemic. And that's impacted more on Black and minority ethnic workers, where 15% have been faced with fire and rehire compared with 8% of white workers. And as we've seen a step up, we've seen a step up in employers' use of hardball tactics as they seek to use the lockdown and worker concerns about job security to slash costs for the long term. So they're not just responding to immediate economic pressures, but they're looking for savings into the future as well. And the use of fire and rehire at its least, or at least the threat of it, is the most blatant use of these strong arm tactics. And that's been emboldened by the lockdown that's seen many workers lose their jobs and leave others in fear of unemployment. The Resolution Foundation reported that the economy experienced its biggest recession in over 300 years last year, with a third of private sector workers put on furlough at its peak. And when furlough ends, it's due to end in September, there's real concern there'll be a very sharp rise in unemployment as employers lose their subsidies and want to cut back on labour to increase their profitability. I mean, in this context, you might see that why employers would want to cut wages because of the lockdown and the sort of impact on their profits. But when we look at fire and rehire in the next slide, we see actually a very different picture. And there we go. So I'm gonna have to move you all around a bit. So these are 4 of the companies that have used fire and rehire over the last year to force their workforces into worse terms and conditions. And these are their profits, and they're not showing actually a suppression of profits. And in fact, they all continue to function through the pandemic. So it isn't just about the economic slowdown and the recession that's forcing them into this. This is actually designed for them to boost their profits. So we can see that JDE made over 800 million in the preceding year, British Gas 172 million, and that's the first 6 months of this year. Go Northwest bus company's parent company, Go Ahead, had an operating profit of 121 million, and Weetabix, which is also going for fire and rehire of section its workforce, had 112 million pound in profit. So there is a question. I just thought I'd throw this in as to why would they be motivated? You know, is it just pure greed? But you know, I thought it'd be worth him mentioning here that there is a long-term problem with British capitalism about the amount of profit, about the rate of profit. It's been experiencing a falling rate of profit, as you see, going back to the 1950s. Obviously, the pandemic has sort of made that worse at the moment, but there's actually a long-term trend, and the only way, you know, this affects the competitiveness of companies in the UK, and they're seeking ways to improve their competitiveness by trying to drive up the rate of profit. And in fact, the pandemic is a good cover for doing that. We saw similar around the austerity when after the banking crisis, when BMW were rolling minis off at record rates, they actually went for the pensions, and we saw a wave of pension attacks with austerity used as a way of justifying that. And more often than not, there wasn't really a justification at all in their own terms. It was about increasing their profitability. I would say a little bit about how the unions have responded to the crisis. I mean, you'd think, given the scale of deaths and the economic crisis, the social dislocation, you'd think that there would be uproar. But in fact, the unions have actually been very quiet. And they've been talking to the government throughout, and they've been seeking to win some degree of security. So things like furlough, they're involved in negotiating, and the TUC actually, has claimed victory over the extension of furlough when it was due to end. And we have to say, that was an important thing, but that was mainly about protecting employers and, making sure that the economy could reopen again. It was a stopgap more for them. And the money, the 66 billion that was paid out for that, we can expect that to be clawed back, and that to be clawed back from the public sector spending, and we can expect it to be clawed back from workers in terms of the tax on their wages and conditions. The workers are going to be very much like with the banking crisis. We expect workers to be made to pay the price. And the orientation of the TUC and the leaders of the union movement has been very much about trying to get, well, I'll give you a quote. They've been looking to the Tory government to, quote, force employers to negotiate contract changes with workers and their unions rather than unilaterally imposing them. So rather than go to the workforce, go to their members, the 6 million members, and say, right, we want to organise a fight back over the way you've been treated. We want to hold the government to account. We want to make sure that you don't pay the price in terms of fall in living standards, etc., lost job losses. We're going to apply to a government that's that's actually let you die. That's their strategy. And this is sort of borne out with things like Barry Gardner's bill. Barry's bill, where again they're looking to win a change in law in Parliament to prevent employers imposing contract changes on workers on worse terms and conditions, and they would require the support of the Tory MPs to win. There's an incredibly weak strategy. In some cases, they have called strikes, but following overwhelming votes in favour of action. Yet only one of these has won. That was the go-ahead strike. And we've seen that union officials have been calling off the strikes for talks, undermining the workers' confidence, and then coming back with a rotten deal. And in the case of JDE, actually heralding a rotten deal with a victory. And just to quote one of our own comrades, with losses of £9,000 for some workers, if that's victory, you would hate to see what defeat looks like. I mean, I would argue the situation arises from an ongoing lack of confidence among workers to initiate and maintain strikes independent of the trade union leadership, leading to a situation where the TU bureaucracy feels more pressure from the bosses of the government to deliver a quiescent workforce that helps meet their priorities in the crisis in exchange for some deals at the top table. And a case in point is the blowing flesh and pay rise that's being offered to nurses at the moment. If there was ever a group of workers who you could get public support for action, you'd think it would be the NHS for their role in the pandemic. And we've already seen an outbreak of significant protests in the key cities to demand 15% as payback for what was lost following the banking crisis, and for the efforts they've made, that health workers have made during the pandemic. Yet rather than build on that activity in any serious fashions, all the unions have opted for consultative ballots without any commitment to winning union members to vote for them in sufficient numbers. An attempt to discuss this in my own local unison health branch was met by a regional official trying to tell the branch committee they couldn't take a position. So the leadership in the local branch has been told you can't advocate for strike action. Absolutely appalling decision. Thankfully, they told him they actually got a bit of spine and said that they would tell members that they would support them taking action, but still actually quite a weak statement. They weren't going to mobilise any of the tens of thousands of pounds of branch resources to say vote yes to strike. And again, it's a consultative ballot. Very little effort's been put in by the unions. If you compare this with 2011 pension strike, where actually there was very concerted effort to organise meetings and campaigning from the top to win a vote for action, albeit that they then went and called it off after one day. Now, there have been examples of the rank and file pushing the union leaders to act. We've seen that in the ballots at JDE, and we saw it with the NEU. And the NEU, the strength of their action was incredibly impressive. They forced the government into lockdown, so quite a political action there. And why the trade union leaders behaving like that? Well, I would argue it's because essentially their role is to broker a deal between the workers they're elected to represent and the employers, but within the confines of capitalism. This means accommodating to some degree to the demands of capital. The amount they concede depends on the balance of class forces. That is how much pressure they are under from the bosses and how much pressure they're under from the workers. And in times of crisis, this means accepting the limitations of capital and reducing workers' demands. The top leadership is often integrated into the establishment, but at the same time is subject to pressure from below. So their approach to strikes, rather than being weapons of class struggle about winning key victories for workers, winning what they want, they're bargaining chips to win negotiations where they can meet the boss's part of the way rather than deliver whole out and out victories. Hence strikes get called off rather than talks going ahead when the strikes are on, which is something we argued at JDE. We warned about this. We saw it in the British gas strike. But at the same time, the union leaders can be pushed into action if there is pressure from below. And some union leaders are more likely to support action than others. So who gets elected in unions matters. And as in the case of the Unite election, where the SWP is backing Sharon Graham, who, though not a genuine rank and file candidate, is more orientated on building workplace organisation, distinct from the other candidate of the left, Steve Turner, who looks to partnership with the bosses. I mean, ultimately, what we want to see is a confident working class that can initiate and lead fights in its own right, independent of TU leadership. And I'll give you an example that we've seen in Oxford, where the postal workers union, prior to the closure of the depot, was taking independent action outside the trade union laws, and then the union officials were being forced to then ballot and endorse the action. So workers, can organise independently, and that's the kind of action that we want to see. But we're in a period of quite low confidence. So the role, I would argue, the role of socialists in this time is that we need to be active in the unions to help to build the fights, and a rank and file leadership that can lead the union members to carry out fight when officials move towards a sellout. That we need to build solidarity and raise the political level of struggles when they do break out. And we want to organise the most militant workers. We cannot rely purely on economic struggles to advance to socialism. We need to win workers to revolutionary politics and organisation that can continue the fight outside periods of economic struggle. And I'll leave it there, comrades.